anime arena fighters are a dime a dozen, so it's not easy for a new one to stand out from the pack and get players truly excited. Especially as there's always a level of skepticism directed towards any new arena fighter that's announced, because if we're being honest, the vast majority of arena fighters are just kinda meh. My Hero Academia, One Punch Man, Kill la Kill, Jujutsu Kaisen, the list of popular anime series with mediocre to bad arena fighter adaptations is never ending. But that's not to say that there aren't a few standouts. I think CyberConnect has always done a good job with the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm series, and we got one of the best arena fighters ever made last year with Dragon Ball Sparking Zero. But the hit-to-miss ratio in this genre is undeniably not great. So when we got the announcement of Bleach Rebirth of Souls last year, while a lot of Bleach fans were excited, I was looking at the game pondering the big question. Will this be yet another serviceable, but ultimately underwhelming arena fighter, or the rare standout that pulls off this style of gameplay well? And after spending 30 hours with Rebirth of Souls, I can say that between those two options, Bleach Rebirth of Souls falls closer on the scale to the latter than the former. Rebirth of Souls is a good video game, with its varied roster of fighters and surprisingly thoughtful combat mechanics, giving Rebirth of Souls fights a little more depth than your average anime brawler. However, its lack of maps, underwhelming visuals, and often clumsy story presentation prevent Rebirth of Souls from reaching the heights of the genre's heavyweights. Before we get any further into this review, I should point out that while I usually strive to keep my reviews spoiler-free, this review is a bit of a special case. Seeing as Rebirth of Souls is a fighting game based on an anime, there are technically spoilers for the Bleach anime and manga here, as in the footage I've captured, you're going to see locations, characters, and transformations from deep into the series. So if you're new to Bleach and particularly sensitive to spoilers, beware. With that warning out of the way, let's get into it. As one of the so-called Big Three alongside Naruto and One Piece, the Bleach franchise was a huge deal throughout my childhood and teenage years. But of the Big Three, Bleach is by far the one that's received the least love in video game form, especially in recent years. There have been scores of Naruto and One Piece games over the past 2.5 decades, but Bleach on the other hand had a few DS games, a PS3 Musou, a Wii brawler, and a bunch of PSP games that never got localised for the Western world. But aside from a PS4 port of a mobile gacha game, there hasn't been a console Bleach game since Soul Resurrection was released on the PS3 in 2011. And when you look at the Bleach games we have gotten, they fall in line with most licensed video games. There are a couple of gems, but mostly a whole lot of mediocrity. Naturally, after going almost 15 years without a new console game, Bleach's ravenous fanbase has been hungry for a new AAA Bleach game for a while now. So when Rebirth of Souls was announced, it drummed up a good amount of excitement among the Bleach fandom, and I will say, there was reason to be optimistic. From the very first trailer, Rebirth of Souls did look a cut above most other arena fighters, so while I was never expecting Rebirth of Souls to be some genre-defining hit, I also didn't think we were going to have a Jujutsu Kaisen Cursed Clash style disaster on our hands either. And Bleach Rebirth of Souls met, if not slightly exceeded, my expectations for it. Most of my time with Rebirth of Souls was spent playing through its surprisingly meaty story mode. Rebirth of Souls' expansive campaign is a far cry from the 5 to 10 hour long story modes you'll find in most arena fighters, clocking in at around 25 hours to beat. This is because it covers an awful lot of ground, as Rebirth of Souls offers a truncated retelling of the Bleach storyline, covering everything from the Agent of the Shinigami arc up to the end of the Arrancar arc, which is a huge chunk of the Bleach storyline. For context, that's about 340 chapters of the manga, and Tamsoft has managed to cram in almost all of the major plot beats into this story mode, though you do of course lose a lot of the smaller moments, as when you're retelling such a huge story in game form, sacrifices need to be made. So while Rebirth of Souls is a good refresher, it's objectively not a great way to experience the story of Bleach for the first time. I'm not going to go too deep into the nitty-gritty of the story of Bleach, as if you're watching a review for a Bleach video game, odds are you're already acquainted with the series. But for those who are watching out of sheer curiosity, I'll lay out the broad strokes of the premise. Bleach follows Ichigo Kurosaki, a 15-year-old high school student who can see and communicate with ghosts. One day, Ichigo has a run-in with Rukia, a Soul Reaper from the Soul Society, a plane of existence separate from our world where people's souls go when they die. Rukia's been sent to the world of the living to dispatch hollows, evil spirits that need to be purged rather than sent to the Soul Society. Upon their meeting, Rukia is bewildered by the fact that Ichigo can see her, as humans aren't supposed to be able to see Soul Reapers, whereas Ichigo is just incensed at Rukia's sudden appearance in his bedroom. But as the two bicker, a hollow appears and attacks Ichigo's family. Ichigo, being able to see the hollow, rushes in headfirst to protect his sister, but being a human, is completely powerless against this malevolent spirit, leading to Rukia intervening to save Ichigo and getting injured in the process. Now with Rukia out of commission for a while, someone needs to step up and protect the living from these hollows, so Rukia, left with no other choice, infuses Ichigo with her energy, bestowing upon him the powers of a Soul Reaper. Of course, like all shonen anime, the story spirals and gets more grandiose from here, with the next arc, which makes up a good portion of Rebirth of Souls story mode, following Ichigo's adventure through the Soul Society to prevent Rukia's execution, after she's sentenced to death for transferring her powers to a human, a grave offence for a Soul Reaper, with all of these events tying into a much grander conspiracy. Bleach is filled with spectacular fights, a story full of twists and turns, and all the tropey charm of the 2000s shonen scene. Though I will say that while I read all of Bleach as it was coming out, as I was massively into anime and manga as a kid and teenager, and mostly enjoyed it, Bleach was always my least favourite of the big three, and revisiting it here for the first time in a decade, I was filled with nostalgia, but also reminded of the problems I had with Bleach's story, namely its overstuffed cast, which causes the story to feel unfocused at times, and its cringe-worthy comic relief. Looking at you, Cone. God, I hate that character. The structure of Rebirth of Souls story mode is pretty standard fare for an anime arena fighter. It's basically a series of in-engine cutscenes adapting scenes from the anime, with dozens of playable fights interspersed throughout. But from the second I booted up Rebirth of Souls, I couldn't help but find the inconsistent presentation of its story mode jarring. While this isn't a low-effort story mode by any means, and has clearly had a lot more work put into it than something like My Hero 1's Justice, which retold the story of My Hero Academia through a series of still images with VO over them, Rebirth of Souls shows many telltale signs that the developer's budget was spread a little too thin. The cutscenes in Rebirth of Souls are quite wonky. While a few of the bigger moments have had a little more care put into them, 90% of the cutscenes are just the in-game character models standing in place talking, with only their eyes and mouths being lightly animated, while the camera is nailed down, pointing at them from one awkwardly still angle. I also couldn't help but notice in these cutscenes that certain characters' faces look a bit off-model from how they appear in the anime and manga. But then there are other aspects of the campaign where you can tell Tamsoft put in a ton of work, certainly more than you'd find in most anime games. For example, Tamsoft had to build a ridiculous amount of character models for Rebirth of Souls story mode, as throughout its 25-hour runtime, you'll fight many enemies ranging from Hollows to Soul Reapers to Arunkars who aren't playable in the game. So Tamsoft must have expended so much time and effort modelling characters who only appear in a couple of cutscenes and fights. A lesser game would have just skipped over these moments, so I respect Tamsoft for putting in the work here. Rebirth of Souls also offers full English VO, which was a pleasant surprise given how much dialogue there is throughout the story mode. It's not uncommon for studios to only include the Japanese VO tracks, so the publisher can save a few bucks. But with how lengthy Rebirth of Souls is, and how expansive the cast of characters is, Bandai Namco evidently shelled out a good chunk of change for the voice work here, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. With how long it's been since the last console Bleach game, I'm sure it would have been difficult to gauge how well Rebirth of Souls would perform, so I wouldn't have been surprised to see Bandai Namco give Tamsoft only a shoestring budget for this game, but they evidently had a degree of confidence in the project from the jump. The most important aspect of any fighting game is how it plays, and I'm pleased to say that Rebirth of Souls plays better than the vast majority of arena fighters on the market. Rebirth of Souls does a great job of recapturing the look of Bleach's fights, as characters clash their cartoonishly big swords both on land and in mid-air. But it also offers a surprisingly thoughtful combat system, with more depth than many of its contemporaries. Oh, and strap in, because Rebirth of Souls combat mechanics involve a ton of jargon words from Bleach, Konpaku, Hakugeki, Kikon techniques, etc, etc. So I will be mindful to clarify using normal video game terminology too when necessary, so as not to make this review completely incomprehensible to those unfamiliar with Bleach. The first thing you'll likely notice when playing Rebirth of Souls is that its camera perspective is completely different from that of your average arena fighter. While most arena fighters are played from a behind-the-back perspective, Rebirth of Souls utilises a 3/4 side-on perspective that's slightly closer to a standard 3D fighter like Tekken or Soul Calibur than something like Ultimate Ninja Storm or Budokai Tenkaichi. But the slight skew to the camera perspective creates a strange blend of 2D and 3D movement that gives Rebirth of Souls a game feel unlike anything I've played before, so it does take a minute to get used to it. But it's certainly a novel design choice, and the more I played Rebirth of Souls, the more I grew to like the choice. I think it suits the bombastic sword fights of Bleach well, and I'm glad to see Tamsoft go out of their way to try something different here. At a glance, Rebirth of Souls appears to share the same basic structure as any other arena fighter. You have your light attack, your heavy attack, or flash attack as it's called here, which usually has a little more range, and your signature attack that varies for each character. For instance, Rukia will fling a fireball spell, Ichigo will perform a massive overhead slash, or Uryu will fire a bunch of arrows into the sky that will rain down on his opponent. Repeatedly mashing light and flash attacks will string together combos, and the combo will be modified depending on which direction you hold the thumbstick while attacking. Each character also has a guard break attack, and a couple of spiritual pressure techniques, supers that require the energy you build up while fighting to perform. But as you start playing Rebirth of Souls, the game's hidden depth starts to shine through, as you discover the major differences here from other arena fighters. Rebirth of Souls has a rock, paper, scissors style mechanic embedded into its battle system, where each of your main abilities has a counter. Your guard can block attacks, a breaker technique tears through a guard, and an attack can stop a breaker. So you need to anticipate your opponent's next move, and be ready to counteract it at all times. But you also need to be careful not to rely too heavily on certain abilities in Rebirth of Souls. Your guard, for instance, is limited by a guard gauge. Overuse it, and you'll be left in a vulnerable state where you can't defend yourself at all until it refills, forcing you to stay on the offensive throughout fights. Little details like this make Rebirth of Souls a more thoughtful brawler than your average anime fighter. But the biggest difference between Rebirth of Souls and other arena fighters is that Rebirth of Souls is built around a life system. In each fight, you and your opponent start with a set amount of konpaku, Bleach is equivalent to stocks. You'll usually start with 9 of them, and your goal is to whittle your opponent's konpaku down to 0 to win. As you fight, you'll lower your opponent's health until you get their health bar below 30%, at which point you can nail them with a powerful Hakugeki technique to knock them back, then follow up with a Kikon move, your splashy ultimate attack that will shatter their konpaku, taking a couple of their stocks. While most of the time a Kikon move takes 2 stocks, under the right circumstances, it can take more. Namely, if your character is in their awakened form, as yes, Rebirth of Souls features an awakening mechanic. Because what good shonen anime doesn't have transformations that massively elevate their characters' power levels? Everyone in Rebirth of Souls roster has a transformation, and depending on who you're playing as, their awakening will be their Shunko, Bunkai, Shikai, or Resurrection state. Your awakening bar slowly fills up throughout fights, and serves as Rebirth of Souls' comeback mechanic, as once transformed, the character's strength is boosted significantly. They're given access to a new moveset, and instead of taking the standard 2 stocks, their Kikon move will take 4, 5, or even 6, allowing you to get back in the fight, even if you're 3 or 4 stocks down on your opponent. While many arena fighters like Ultimate Ninja Storm and Sparking Zero offer tag team battle mechanics, Rebirth of Souls is a strictly one-on-one fighter. No teammates, no support characters. And something Rebirth of Souls deserves a lot of commendations for is making its roster feel genuinely varied. When I look at something like the Ultimate Ninja Storm games, or the Budokai Tenkaichi games, it's undeniable that many characters in the roster feel similar to play as, with many characters feeling like little more than palette swaps of one another. But in Bleach Rebirth of Souls, nearly every fighter feels distinct. This is largely thanks to the restraint shown in the roster size, which allowed for more time to be spent designing each character. Rebirth of Souls has 33 playable fighters at launch, which is certainly a very big roster by normal fighting game standards, but it's not in the range of the Naruto and Dragon Ball games, which have literally hundreds of playable fighters. Though it wouldn't be an anime fighter without several versions of our protagonist, so of those 33, a handful are just different Ichigos. But hey, it's still a far cry from something like Sparking Zero launching with almost 20 fucking Gokus. There's a fantastic amount of variety in Rebirth of Souls roster. You'll find just about every Soul Reaper, Arrancar, or Vizard you would expect, with every character's moveset being faithfully plucked from the manga. This means you've got a roster with a huge lineup of different weapons and abilities, offering an assortment of playstyles. Chad, for example, is a tanky, close-range fighter who pummels enemies with his bare hands, while Uryu, being a Quincy, fights with a bow, meaning he's more of a ranged fighter. While Renji, with his extending sword, is a great mid-range attacker who can juggle enemies from an arm's length away. I've always loved the design of Renji, in particular his sword, so I guess it's somewhat unsurprising that he quickly became my main in Rebirth of Souls. But I was pleasantly surprised by just how many fighters I enjoyed playing as here. Soifone is such a fun fighter. She dashes around the battlefield, throwing flurries of punches at lightning speed. I love a fast fighter, so Soifone and Yoruichi also became fast favourites of mine in Rebirth of Souls. But the character I was truly the most surprised by here was Kurotsuchi. To be honest, I always found Kurotsuchi a little grating in the anime, but he's awesome to play as in Rebirth of Souls. I love the choice to give him his grappling hook, allowing him to pull enemies straight back to him after knocking them away to extend his combos. Each fighter in Rebirth of Souls also has various alternate costumes, showcasing their different appearances from throughout the series. It was a pleasant surprise to see so many alternate costumes included in the base version of the game, rather than being nickel and dimed for them through microtransactions. The cherry on top of Rebirth of Souls fights is the oddly charming soundtrack that accompanies them. As someone who grew up in the 2000s, there's something very nostalgic about seeing these ridiculously over-the-top sword fights play out as Japanese butt rock blares in the background. The one thing I think is going to hamper Rebirth of Souls' replayability in the long run is its lack of stages. Rebirth of Souls is far lighter on stages than its contemporaries, with many of the arenas padding out the stage select screen simply being day-night variants of other stages. I think the stages that are here are mostly good, and I like the light environmental destruction here. It's cool seeing the floorboards get torn up as they get struck by one of the gargantuan weapons the heroes and villains of Bleach wield. But while playing through the story mode, it did wear on me how much I was seeing the same arenas over and over again. A few more stages would have gone a long way here. Outside of the story mode, there are a couple of extra modes to waste some time with. By completing optional objectives throughout the story, you'll unlock new branches in the Secret Stories mode, where you can play through some bonus story missions as a selection of different characters. Then there's the mission mode, where you'll select a character, choose from 3 tiers of difficulty, then fight a series of enemies back to back on one health bar. It's essentially just Rebirth of Souls' version of the survival mode you'll find in most fighting games. Rebirth of Souls, of course, also offers both local and online multiplayer. I only dabbled briefly with the online multiplayer, as it's not what I generally come to this style of game for, but in my brief experience, I found the netcode to be wildly inconsistent, which for some reason is pretty common fare in this style of game. Like the Ultimate Ninja Storm games, sometimes online matches in Rebirth of Souls would be smooth sailing. Other times, even if both me and the other players' signals were perfect, I'd encounter enough input delay and lag to make fights unplayable. At just 4 real modes, Rebirth of Souls doesn't have as many modes as other fighters, but the trade-off is that you're getting a far more expansive story mode than you'll find in nearly any other fighting game. Normally, I'm not a huge graphics guy. Don't get me wrong, I love a pretty game as much as the next gamer, but I always choose to play games on performance mode over fidelity mode, because I'll always take a stable frame rate over slightly prettier visuals, and I'm usually the person who gives games some leeway when it comes to their visual fidelity. So I'm a little surprised to say that my biggest complaint with Rebirth of Souls is its inconsistent visual quality. Rebirth of Souls is a strangely ugly game at times. As I mentioned before, many of the characters' faces look slightly off-model in cutscenes, and there's a strange haziness to the gameplay in Rebirth of Souls. During fights, it's almost like there's a thin layer of Vaseline over the screen, as everything just looks a tad out of focus. But then when you launch one of the flashy Keycon moves, all of a sudden everything comes into focus, and the game looks gorgeous during these brief pre-rendered animations. The game looks so much higher res during these animations that it's actually jarring when it transitions back to gameplay. One final thing I need to point out before wrapping up this review is that while I played the PS5 version of Rebirth of Souls and had a technically flawless experience, it's worth noting that the PC launch was a whole different story, with Rebirth of Souls' PC version launching in a disastrous state, where it was quite literally unplayable for many players who bought it there due to endless crashes, which is of course totally unacceptable. But you can only review a game based on your own experience with it, and as I didn't play Rebirth of Souls on PC, I had a much more positive experience than most PC players seemingly did. So if you're primarily a PC gamer, that is something to keep in mind, and you're probably better off passing on Rebirth of Souls, at least until you're sure all the technical hiccups of the PC version have been ironed out. As any anime fan knows, the quality of licensed games is all over the place. For every good video game based on a beloved anime, there are 3 bad ones, so I taper my expectations going into any of these games, and doing so allows a game to occasionally pleasantly surprise you. Bleach Rebirth of Souls is one such game. Rebirth of Souls isn't the greatest fighting game you'll ever play, with its lacklustre visuals and clumsy story presentation keeping it from measuring up to the best of the genre, and I'd still be more likely to revisit Sparking Zero, Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, or even Demon Slayer the Hinokami Chronicles over Rebirth of Souls, but it is still a fun brawler that offers far more depth than you might expect at first blush. Even with its shortcomings, Rebirth of Souls is certainly better than most of the slop that pollutes this subgenre of fighters. So if you're looking for an anime brawler to duke it out in with friends, you could do far worse than Rebirth of Souls. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can find countless other videos on my channel, including my recent review of Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, and be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming review of South of Midnight. Till next time, be well guys.